Welcome back to the Brothers Mahoney. This is Michael. And I am James. And today we are talking about Doctor Who and the Pescatons, which is interesting in that it is the very first officially licensed Doctor Who audio drama before Big Finish took the idea by storm. And it was originally released back in July 1976. So you can see the age there.
Not only can you see the age there, you can see the age and you look at the picture. Because this was, of course, originally released on vinyl.
I also saw some classy looking cassette tape releases.
Yeah, and I think it came to CD in the 90s. Or was it the 80s? Which would be an even better joke if you actually had any involvement, but alas, they do not.
Yeah, and this was written by Victor Pemberton, who, somewhat interestingly, he did write one story for Classic Who, Fairy from the Deep, it's a Second Doctor story.
Which we have not actually watched yet. We've actually started it 2 times, but it was just poor timing both attempts. So it's one of the few ones released on Blu-ray/DVD that we haven't actually gotten to yet.
Yeah, and this one stars the Fourth Doctor along with Sarah Jane, so it's Tom Baker and Elisabeth Sladen here, or sort of, but we'll talk about that. And it runs about 47 minutes. It's sort of the equivalent of the Centauran Experiment. So it's just sort of 2 episodes total. We have the theme song and the ending theme between them, so it's sort of like that, and it came out, like we said, July 76, and I don't know if that was officially between seasons or not, but it is, like we said, the very first Doctor Who audio. Even if, and we'll talk about it, even if it may not be the most gripping stuff, for like the historical reason alone, it is sort of interesting.
But before we get into the details of this most intriguing part of Doctor Who history, would you like to go over the plot for us, Michael?
Of course. The Fourth Doctor and his companion Sarah battle against some of the most heinous foes to emerge from the outer universe, the Pescatons. The Doctor finds himself in the capital city of London. The population is bewildered and trembling beneath the violent onslaught of a merciless invader. Who or what is the mighty Zor, whose green slanted luminous eyes glare out from the dark of night like giant emeralds? What is the powerful alien force that is bringing our civilization to a standstill, threatening to annihilate everything in its path? This is the story of a dying planet, of a deadly weed, and the merciless creatures themselves. It is a challenge to the Doctor, a frightening race against time. And I've never actually read that plot before, so I could have held in my amusement toward the end there. I imagine that came on the back of the vinyl or something, but it's sort of like dramatic in a classy way.
It would pit a lot of Big Finish plots to same. It's one of those plots where it really makes the story sound like it's a lot more than it is. I guess you could say it's certainly trying to sell it.
I mean, I have to imagine in 1976, and I didn't write this down, but much like how Big Finish runs Doctor Who like post 99 when it comes to audio dramas, this was released by Algo Records, and I'm not sure what else they have done, if anything, in like the Doctor Who universe. It's worth mentioning that they're the ones who put this out. But I will say it may not be as captivating a plot as Something Inside has, but they're trying something new, so hey, I guess they just did what they had to do. I sort of wonder how many copies of this sold actually, but neither here nor there.
To be fair, it was Tom Baker's Doctor in the 70s. It probably sold quite a bit if they got the right promotion.
Yeah, you know what? It might also be seen as like a nice proof of concept that bringing the Doctor to an audio-only format might be worth investing in. And like we mentioned in the last discussion, there have been a handful of audio-only adventures before Big Finish took over. What's it, Slipback with Colin Baker? Is that the name?
Yeah, that's actually one among the ones I'm most interested in listening to because that's the 6th Doctor with Perry, and that one for a fact I know it did come out in between seasons. So it's actually a good way to follow what was going on with the Doctor and the companion in between, well, them trying to throw Colin Baker off the air,
Yeah,
unfortunately, as it went.
yeah, and I know there's like Ghost of Unspace, Paradise of Death, Exploration Earth, another one, under different circumstances, but another one is Tom Baker. So there have been a handful, and this just happens to be the first one. So it's even if, like I said, even if it's not great, it might be a good proof of concept. And like we mentioned, this one has Tom Baker, Elisabeth Sladen, and the only other voice that we really get is Zoe, who's voiced by Bill Mitchell. And I don't have much to say about Mitchell aside from this random tidbit that initially Bill Mitchell actually had a brief scene in Frontier in Space, which it was a Thor Doctor's toy. Apparently, last minute it was cut. So that makes this audio his only official Doctor Who credit, which I think is sort of interesting, even if it doesn't mean much.
Well, that's until Zoe shows up in another Big Finish audio.
You know what, though? I could see them bringing him back, the Pescatons. In fact, I'd be surprised if the Pescatons weren't mentioned in some capacity somewhere. I'm sure they will.
They
It'd be
do
fun.
feel like the type of species that would get a throwaway Munson in a book or something of the sort.
I really wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I'd be even more surprised if it did happen once. One interesting thing about this one is that it's framed, the story is framed by the Doctor himself in like a first person narration type thing. With the Doctor opening about how the TARDIS is being brought to Earth through some type of magnetic pole type thing, and it's sort of setting up the scenes with the Doctor talking, and then we sometimes sort of go into the scenes where we get the actual voice performances. It's an interesting technique. It sort of feels a little bit dated. Again, this is the first attempt at trying this type of thing, and it's sort of charming. They sort of cut through a lot of scenes that might have been interesting to see. Sometimes you don't see how the Doctor escapes a certain situation. We just know that he does because he tells us he did. Like I said, experimenting with an audio only format was probably it's probably a bit of an experience. So I think they do what they can.
Yeah, the background music is very atmospheric in terms of adding to the mood of the scenes. The very first scene with the Doctor and Sarah landing on the beach is a very well done first scene, in my opinion.
Yeah, you can hear the lapping waters around them. It sounds nice and atmospheric. Sometimes the music itself can be a bit discordant. But I was largely getting, I don't know if you got the same thing, but I was getting some like sort of Three Doctors vibes with some of the random music they had in that.
I actually did think about the Three Doctors while listening to this, and if I had, it would have just made me more disappointed with this, since the Three Doctors is a really fun story. And this is, while intriguing in many ways, not the most fun listening experience, but if you do want to listen to it, I think I'll point out right now that at least as of this recording, it's on YouTube for free. And it's from 1976. If it's not truly in public domain, it really might as well be. And if it's taken off YouTube for any reason in between this recording and us actually getting this out, or you listen to this 2,000 years in the future, which would be incredible. Hey there. But it should be on, if nowhere else, on Internet Archive. Either way, you'll be able to find online if you want to. And as we said earlier, it's only 47, 48 minutes. So you can make your own opinions, especially if you're an aficionado of the Big Finish era, because then you could compare what you know of Big Finish. And my brother and I have only listened to, in totality, 17, 18 Big Finish stories, maybe 19.
Yeah, not very many.
But if you've listened to a lot more of them, then you would have a much better grasp to compare a Big Finish to one of the OGs, as it were, of Doctor Who audio recordings.
Yeah, I also want to add that if you happen to be a big fan of the Fourth Doctor, if Tom Baker is your Doctor, for that reason alone, this might be worth checking out. Because again, even if it may not be like a stellar story, seeing O'Hare and Tom Baker again in some new original material, it might be enough to wet your whistle. But speaking of the story itself, it's pretty simple. Doctor and Sarah Jane land, like James said, on this little. I actually don't know if you'd call it an island. It was they land near a bunch of water. They find some Pescatons. Doctor tries to convince the scientific community they're not interested, and then boom, we get like an all-out invasion. In fact, the cliffhanger of the first episode is the invasion had begun. I'll give them props. It's a good cliffhanger.
It actually reminded me a lot, and you'll see why in a second, of the two-part Goosebumps Series 2000 books, Invasion of the Body Creatures, and we'll show both of them up right now. And the reason it reminds me so much of that is these creatures invade, they start out by meteorites crashing into the planet. So the way the first episode ends is the meteorites start crashing on planet Earth, And as Michael said, the announcement the invasion has begun. And it just made me think immediately of the carvel for, I forget if it's part 1 or part 2, of the aliens just crashing onto Earth, holding onto the meteorites. So who knows, maybe Einstein knew about this and wanted to copy it. It seems very unlikely. I've never gotten the sense that he knows almost anything about the UK or UK media, but I suppose it's always possible.
Maybe he's a secret Whovian. But
he would be a really secret one then, because I have never once gotten even a glimpse of that.
But I do think it's worth mentioning that when the Doctor discovers the identity of these aliens, and he's actually ran across them once before, and we'll talk about that. We get actually like a small little flashback. It's sort of interesting. But once the Doctor discovers the threat is the Pescatons, he tries to convince the scientific community. And I know this is just some one-off audio thing. To be fair, we are talking about the Fourth Doctor. But technically speaking, the Doctor is probably still officially a unit scientific advisor. So if he had wanted to get a little bit more clout or a little bit more, I don't know, prestige, he could have opened with that. Like, hey, by the way, cow unit, you can get this conformed, talk to the brigadier. I know what I'm talking about. And there's no evidence that he approached it that way. And again, I could actually see the Fourth Doctor not wanting to do that. Even so, if he was actually serious about this, and if he was actually concerned, and I think he was, then I might have advised going that route.
And the thing is, you wouldn't even need Nicholas Courtney on the audio. You could just have a quick voice of it. I told them about me being the former scientific advisor for UNIT, and they made a phone call to my golden friend, the brigadier, to conform. You just need that one line, then you can move on with the story. But honestly, the scientific community not believing him doesn't really add much anyway, frankly.
Yeah, it really doesn't, because you get this proof like in 16 minutes or something, and like boom, an alien attacks like a zoo, and it's sort of fun. Like these things, I forget how tall it says they are, 8-9 feet or something, but they do look pretty powerful as far as strength goes. They like literally bite someone, and I think it mentions how they sort of toss them into the bars of like a, in a zoo. So it's a scene that has a decent amount of casualties. I was actually getting, we've mentioned before, I come from sort of like a horror movie background. I was getting humanoids from the deep vibes actually during that scene. It's a really fun attack scene on the docks, and I think when I was listening to that, I was sort of visualizing that sequence. So it's sort of fun, and some elements can be interesting, but like as an overall package, I guess what I might say is it feels a bit dry, somewhat ironically. Actually, speaking of a bit dry, I do think the origin of the Pescatons is sort of interesting. Apparently, they come from the planet Pasca, which, as the Doctor describes it, is a planet from a dying galaxy. And I'm not an astronomy guy, so I don't know the science behind this. The planet is being pulled slowly toward the sun of that galaxy. And because the planet is like majority water, since it's being pulled closer and closer to the sun, the water is evaporating. And the Pescatons, which seem to be an aquatic based species, I mean, they're sort of screwed. They're on this dying planet in a dying galaxy. And to be honest, I forget the circumstances in which the Doctor lands there. I think it mentioned that he was sort of pulled there. He might have just been interested in checking it out. I'm not sure if you remember.
Yeah, there was talk about a magnetic pole to the planet, and he got out. He saw how arid everything looked,
Yeah,
and
it looked like pretty much like desert, to be honest.
and in this flashback, where the Doctor is traveling alone, he just goes out, explores the arid, dry, former watery planet. And if I'm not mistaken, it was the 14th or 15th century too. Not that it really matters. It's an alien planet where he suspected he might be the only one alive, at least for a little bit. Then he started to feel like he was being watched. And apparently he was, because he falls into a sinkhole, and that is where he first meets Zoe in this underground chasm. And Zoe is the leader, the ultra Pescaton, who is this huge thing. It explains him a couple of times, but honestly, it never really matters. The one interesting thing about the Pescatons is that they have quasi-metal skin, and various times during this first meeting with Zoe, it phrased things where it almost made it seem like they were a robotic species, and they aren't. There was no indication that they are, but it did call Zor the creator at one point of the species, and he is physically different from the rest of them. So I don't know, I have some slight confusion about it, but what it really comes down to is they just wanted to phrase things in an interesting way for an audio advancer, so it doesn't really matter. I'm pretty sure that's going to be the answer there. Though apparently Zor has completely see-through eyes, which is a very strange thing to think about, because you can look into his eyes and you can just see his brain, which is most unusual. But after beating Zor, after Zor tries to, in a way, hypnotize him, the doctor, as Michael said earlier, just escapes. It doesn't really say how, just, I had busted Zor, and then I escaped. It was basically the end of the Fires of Vulcan all over again.
Yeah, and I will say one of the few interesting points about the story, in my opinion, was that the Pescatons wanted the doctors to sort of help them find another planet because, like I said, they're on a dying planet. It's not uncommon for the doctor to help species find another planet. I mean, even aside from the Gulf from the revival of the Inquiet Dad, you also had more recently Dad and Babel, where he's trying to help this civilization find another home after they get attacked by these based slug boys. So it's not uncommon for the doctor to want to help out. But he seems, I'll be honest, this may not even be out of character because Tom Baker's doctor was sometimes a bit, I don't even know how to describe him, like a little more alien than a lot of other doctors can sometimes be. But he seems a bit almost callous, and he doesn't seem all that concerned about Pescatons dying out. And it might be because they're being dicks. Maybe it's as simple as that. Like, he sort of judges the character as soon as he meets this group of Pescatons. He meets Zorn, like, I don't want to help this guy. But he doesn't seem that concerned, and I just thought that was sort of interesting, especially when you compare it to how he is later on in his life.
Yeah, generally speaking, you'd expect the doctor to at least offer to save a species, especially if it's from extinction. Usually the doctor doesn't go the route of Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park, everything dies, everything has its time, which, even though we haven't watched it, we've now mentioned that 2 videos in a row. But if a doctor was going to go that route, the fourth doctor might be one more likely to do so. After all, look at how he was in relation to the cranoids. He had absolutely no patience or desire to have that get anywhere because of how invasive of a species it was. And as we see with the Pescaton invasion of London, they're pretty vicious species, and they were apparently known, even if the doctor hadn't met the species before. He apparently had heard of the viciousness of the species.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning that the Doctor multiple times refers to the species literally as evil. That's a word he actually uses, which is sort of atypical, I would say. To be fair, I mean, he's called other species, such as the Daleks and probably the Cybermen, evil before, I imagine. It just seems somewhat odd that this species also gets lumped into that. What's more interesting, though, from a meta perspective, is the fact that this invasion, it wasn't like some secret thing covered up by a unit. I mean, there were literally casualties during this invasion, and the doctor even mentions that the Pescatons became almost a household name. The streets of London were literally empty, and people were afraid staying inside because of this. And James made a reference that, hey, maybe everyone forgot about this because of the crack in time, which I think is actually perfectly valid.
See, that's the nice thing about Doctor Who history, and we mentioned this a couple of times when we were talking about the last few seasons of Doctor Who, that all I need is a bullshit excuse and I'm completely content, because the continuity has been cracked and barely existing for a very long time, and there's multiple reasons in universe why that's true. From the toymakers saying that he had made the jigsaw puzzle of the Doctor's history to the crack in time, and I suppose in some ways the universe literally rebooting, but that mostly gets ignored, and I think rightly so. There's a lot of reasons why things don't seem to match up canon-wise or continuity-wise throughout the, at this point, millions of years of the Doctor's existence. So I like to imagine that the Pescaton invasion, the slaughter of a lot of stupid humans, because there's humans who died at the zoo, are like, oh yeah, we beat the Pescaton. our plan worked, blah blah, because it was dying, because it wasn't near salt water, and so they all surrounded the supposed corpse, only for it to wake up and slaughter them all. So well done there, even though the doctor had been warning, hey, stay away. That's just kind of sad on their part, but not for long because they died.
And they do eventually get defeated with high-pitched sonic noises. The Doctor, it seems to me, and maybe it seems like the Doctor just sort of commits a genocide. Like he takes out Zoe, and by taking out Zoe, it sort of destroys the rest of them.
Which is another reason I think there's a strange connection between Zoe and the rest of them, where I think Zoe is maybe they're a hive mind.
I was literally just thinking the same thing. To some extent, they sort of have to be, or have some type of, I don't know, gestalt connection. I'm not sure. But he discovers this high-pitched, I guess, flaw that they have, and he uses it and he's able to beat back the invasion. And it's also worth mentioning, on a side note, that I'm not sure if Sarah Jane really adds much to this story. She pops up at the beginning, and then again toward the finale of the story, but she is largely invisible during the middle portion. And I can't remember, does she actually offer up any suggestions or anything that actually adds to anything?
I recall her and the doctor going through the streets at night, Sarah saving a baby, the doctor distracting the Pescatons from attacking them with a song and dance routine. If you want to hear Tom Baker sing for around 5 seconds, this is the story for you. I don't know what he's singing. It's sort of been what Michigan J. Frog sang, but alas it was not. Although I'm sure that the Pescatons would have preferred to be called Ragtime Gals. But after that, I can't recall her really doing much, honestly. I'm not saying she didn't appear past that point, but if she did, I don't think she added anything. The doctor eventually drags the Pescaton down into either a sewer or an alleyway, and that's when he discovers the weakness they have to high-pitched, shrill noises. And by shrill, I mean we had to turn the sound down on our computer. It was getting really bad. God knows what it sounded like on a record player back in the day. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think Jane really did all that much. Certainly not near the end. It was nice to hear, of course, Elisabeth Sladen's voice, and I guess she probably got paid for this. But since the entire thing almost was completely narrated by Tom Baker, I would say she probably only got at most 5 minutes of quote unquote screen time with her own voice.
Yeah, I'd say so. It sort of makes sense, like James said, because it's narrated by Tom Baker. But even so, it did seem almost like a waste.
I don't know, it was strange either way. I will say one of my favorite scenes was when the Fourth Doctor went to confirm. I suspect he had already had these suspicions, but after landing on the beach, after getting the information about some meteor and some lost expeditions to find the meteor, he went out into the waters of the Thames to try to investigate where this lost meteor is and what it was. And like I said, I think he had his suspicions. And he gets attacked by the plot Michael Rod mentioned, some evil seaweed, which appeared for a total of 2 scenes, and then it did appear again. So I'm not sure it's really worth a tax on the back. But it was a cool plot element. And he gets strangled by the seaweeds while going down into a cave. And eventually, the seaweeds, I suppose, just decided to let him go. I don't remember any particular reason why they were letting him go. You would think, especially if Zoe remembered him, that Zoe wouldn't want to allow him any chance to interrupt his plans. But I suppose Zoe could just be in the long line of those who decide, oh, the doctor couldn't possibly do anything to hurt what I have going on, even though it's the continuation of his entire species. But that's fine. But when the doctor is done being strangled and he looks around the cavern he's in, he sees the old, decayed skeletons and bodies of the former expeditions who had gone lost, all floating around him. I think he refers to it as a ghastly sight, or something to that effect, one that he would prefer never to think about again. And in some ways, this reminded me a little bit, because it happened a couple of times during this scene, during the Pescaton attack on landing that we saw. The very first attack, there was a good 30 seconds of just shrill screaming and cows crossing and all this discordant noise as a single Pescaton caused all this damage and destruction and death. And just parts of that reminded me of the Big Finish story we've previously listened to, Phantasmagoria, because there was a lot of violence and gore in Phantasmagoria that would never have played on TV. Not in the slightest would have played well on TV. But because it's an audio, it's a different type of media, you can get away with a lot more gore. And even here back in the 70s, these things had sharp teeth and sharp claws. How do you think they were killing people? They were swiping at them. They probably weren't biting at them. It mentioned they were a bit slow on land. I'm not sure if he even quite mentioned it. They're supposedly half human, half Sauk, or humanoid Sauks, so make of that what you will. But during the massacres, the doctors probably saw hearts get lopped off. It wasn't going to be a Dalek just using an extermination ray and then you drop being dead. This is going to be a lot more visceral type of killing from an alien creature. And I just think that's a slightly interesting fact about audios in general and this story in particular.
Yeah, maybe it's a good thing that Crack in Time took away the memories. Think about how many traumatized kids were after this. Yeah, and that is one of the things about listening to audio. They have a little more. It's so strange. They have more flexibility in some arenas. It's like books. Books can explore elements different than what TV can, and maybe different than what audio can. And it's sort of interesting seeing the strengths and weaknesses of each medium. And like James said, this can be a little more gory than what you can get from the televised shows. So it's just sort of an interesting aspect.
Yeah, the different mediums and what the strengths and weaknesses of each medium are quite interesting to consider, especially when you're doing first takes and reviews and discussions about these. Because there's a lot of differences from reading a comic story versus an audio versus reading it versus just watching it on TV. There's so many different ways to take in Doctor Who media that no matter what your preference is, you'll be able to find something you like. And if not, then maybe Doctor Who isn't your thing. But before we get to our final thoughts and, in fact, the timeline section of the show, I have been doing a little research on the Pescatons, and I just wanted to throw out a couple of places they have been briefly mentioned in other forms of Doctor Who media. Something that's really fun is this actually had a novelization. Like most classic Who series, this novelization was done by Target and it came out in 1991. We do not happen to own this one, but this would be a very interesting one to own. I'm most interested in the novelizations of media like this, and there were a couple. If I'm not mistaken, the Ultimate Evil, an unreleased Colin Baker story, had a novelization. And the Nightmare Fair also had a novelization in the same vein. So the fact that this also has a novelization, also by the way, written by Victor Pemberton, the writer of this, is really cool, and I'm quite happy it got that treatment. The Pescatons were also mentioned in the Big Finish audio, The One Doctor. Apparently some comedian uses them in the punchline, which is hilarious, and it's the exact type of way I would expect the Pescatons to be just brought up in a random piece of Doctor Who media. They even showed up in a comic strip, The Prison Paradox, which was a 15th Doctor story published by Titan, which, for the record, is the very first time I have heard that the 15th Doctor had a Titan series. So well done to him, because I didn't know they did any past the 13th Doctor. Quite happy that he was able to get one. And the Pescatons apparently show up in a visual cameo, so that's really fun. And there were a couple of other references. Apparently just had a throwaway line that Sarah Jane could not tell the difference between a Pescaton and a crinoid after suffering a memory loss, and that was from Interference, Book 2, which are so complicated I can't possibly get into what those have going on in them, but that's an EDA. And they even popped up in the BBC audios in the Fourth Doctor Hornet's Nest arc, where the Doctor compares the hornets that he's dealing with in that arc to the Pescatons, along with some other lovely alien species. So they do have the place in the wider universe. They didn't just exist for this one random audio. In fact, the Pescatons exist so much in Doctor Who media that Big Finish, as an April Fool's Day joke, released this lovely picture that you're seeing right now for the War Pescatons, showing the very frightful Pescatons on the cover with the 8th Doctor needing to deal with them. And alas, sadly, it's not a real audio, but I do love the fact that Big Finish as a joke put this out. So the Pescatons are still all in all of our hearts as Doctor Who fans.
Yeah, and about the hornet's nest thing, that actually might be sort of an inside joke, because the hornet's nest was only the second time that Tom Baker himself had actually voiced in audio. So he did Doctor Who in the Pescatons, and he didn't do anything else until the hornet's nest. Certainly the fourth Doctor had adventures in Big Finish, but I was voiced by someone else, or they might have been companion chronicles. So the Hornet's Nest was the second time actually doing Doctor Who audio officially. So that might be why they threw that reference in.
Yeah, and of course, eventually Tom Baker came to Big Finish and had a huge, I think still ongoing, long range of Fourth Doctor adventures. But he, before all of that, had 4 serialized stories, adventures, however you like to phrase it, with the BBC audio team. But enough of the joyful Pescaton history. As listeners know, the TARDIS Wiki has a personal timeline for each Doctor, including the extensive extended media, ranging from the comic books, comic strips, Big Finish, and BBC audio, the multiple book ranges, and everything in between. Doctor Who canon, insofar as it actually has one, is a jumbled mess and has been forever. So I just like to see where the stories we're discussing fit into the universe as a whole, as continuity and the narrative timeline has always been of interest to me. And you can't get into more extensive extended media than this one, in some ways. So right before this is actually a very classic placement. On the TARDIS Wiki, this is placed right after the season finale of the 13th season of Doctor Who, which would be the Seeds of Doom. So the Doctor got to enjoy a nice Krynoid invasion, then they got to enjoy a Pescaton invasion. What more could you want? I mean, you could argue the Krynoid isn't so much an invasion, it's just some completely lunatic environmentalist, and I support protecting the environment, but watch the Seeds of Doom before you criticize my description of that guy. He wasn't there. He wasn't there at all. But this story took place right after the Seeds of Doom, and right after this one is the first short story from the Doctor Who annual in 1978, entitled The Sleeping Beast, which is a text story, and Doctor Who annuals back in the day used to actually be interesting. I don't think they're really other interesting nowadays. But back in the 60s through the 80s, they were actually of worth and worthy of the title. Now, the text stories contained within are very similar to TV comic stories in that you can fit them into continuity if you want, but it's a flip of a coin if it even really makes all that much sense. And some might barely feel like Doctor Who stories at all. But nonetheless, they were still a very interesting piece of Doctor Who history. And the Doctor Who annual 1978 came out in September 1977, just around a year and a few months after this came out. So this is one of the few times in our timeline where these stories are back to back are basically within the same range of each other. Usually we veer from something from the 90s to something from the 60s to something from 2025. So this is almost a nice change of pace. But as for this story itself, I think it's quite worth a listen just to see how they were able to do a first-person Doctor Who story. The way that it's told, where we learn a lot of the information just offhandedly with the Doctor explaining it after the fact, is interesting because we just talked about Last of the Titans, which was also kind of a first-person story through the point of view of the Doctor. Although that one felt a lot more alive, we had a lot more scenes of the Doctor talking to the companions or talking to the people who he met during that story. Whereas this one, besides a couple of scenes with Sarah Jane, no one out, and Zoe, I suppose, has a voice actor. No one else gets a voice actor. We only hear about the Doctor interacting with these people after the fact. It's, as Michael said, it's kind of dry, which is ironic for a water-based invasion story. And they even have a scene in an aquarium, and yet it's still kind of dry. It's unfortunate, but there is, I'll give it that. I'll give it that it feels very 70s. It does kind of fit with the era. Doctor Who wasn't really, well, the third Doctors had stories that were pretty dry in the 70s. But the fourth Doctor's 70s stories generally weren't all that dry. But the 70s as a whole, movies during that time, were extremely dry. So I suppose you could just argue it's fitting in with the time. So I'll give it that it's thematic in that context. But honestly, unless you really like Tom Baker or you're a completionist or you think, oh, it's free on YouTube, why not? Which all of those are valid. I wouldn't really suggest taking the time to listen to it. It's like I said, it's only 47, 48 minutes. You'll be fine if you want to listen to it. It's okay. It's interesting. It's different. If you're coming for a really good, enticing story, I don't personally think that you will find it here. But our tastes differ. Do your thoughts differ all that much from mine on this one, Michael?
Not really. I think it's interesting from a historical perspective. And like James said, if you are a Tom Baker fan, that might add to the enjoyment. And don't get me wrong, I'm a Tom Baker fan myself. I guess I'm just not. I guess I'm just not as big enough a fan for this to really click. I guess from my perspective, it's most interesting as a proof of concept to see what Doctor Who in audio format can do. And for that alone, it might be worth listening to. But based on the story itself and the presentation, despite a few interesting scenes, it just didn't really do much for me. Now, James said it's only 45, 46 minutes, so it doesn't take that much out of your day. So it might not be a bad thing to visit at least once, just to get a taste of this styling. But I have to say, it just didn't do much for me. I just don't feel that strongly, to be honest, one way or the other. I didn't particularly hate it, but I'm just sitting here and I feel nothing,
Yeah, I
which
don't
I
think
guess
it's.
is condemnation on its own.
Yeah, I don't think it's one that after listening to it once, you're going to feel a very strong urge to go back to in the next 4,000 years.
It's the TV comic of audio.
In some ways, I feel like it kind of is. Because the doctor seemed a little out of character, just committing genocide. Who is he, an Israeli? I'll do a laughing thing, but I mean, Israel is committing genocide, so that's just true. But no, he seems a little out of character. Sarah's completely fine. And again, it was really nice hearing Elisabeth Sladen, but she didn't add all that much story wise or in any other way. So I don't know, it's quite forgettable. But still, part of Doctor Who history, a very interesting one, and important in a way for it being the first original audio for the Doctor Who universe. So you have to give it some credit for that. And speaking of audios in the Doctor Who universe, what do you have coming up next, Michael?
Next up, we have the third episode of season 1 of Dalek Empire, being Death to the Daleks. And there's only 4 episodes in that season, so we're almost done with that, so that's sort of nice. And it came out 2001, and well, to be honest, I'm actually quite interested. It's strange. I'm actually legitimately interested in where that's going, whereas this one just all sort of flat to me. But it's worth mentioning, like James said, that's just our thoughts. If you happen to listen to this one, in fact, if you listened to this one when it came out back in the 70s, I would be legit interested in hearing your opinion. Yeah, that's all I had on this one. Next up is Death to the Daleks. So if you had any thoughts you want to share, you can comment down below here on YouTube, or you could reach out to us on Twitter at Brothers Mahoney. But as always, you've been enjoying the Brothers Mahoney. I've been Michael.
And I have been James.
Thanks for listening. Have a great night.